honored and happy to be on the IDEO Council. And we have a certain theme going, if you notice, today and yesterday. There's a lot of talk about the evolution of IDEO. And this is another example, in a certain sense, of the evolution of IDEO, because IDEO was born before widespread use of real-world evidence, certainly in surgical trials, or in surgical research, and also before widespread adoption of AI in surgical research. So it's something that we're now trying to catch up with. We have a working group I was very happy to lead, and a paper that we will have off to the Annals of Surgery, looking at how to incorporate real-world data and real-world evidence in IDEO. So we have three fantastic speakers. I'm really excited to introduce them. What we're going to do is, after the first speaker, Danny Prieto-Alhambra, we'll have questions for him. And after that, though, we're going to have our next two speakers, and we'll save questions for them till the end, just in the interest of time and schedules. And what I would love to do is to allow you, Danny, to introduce yourself, because you'll introduce yourself far better than I will. And, I'm delighted to welcome you up.
Okay, thank you so much, Arsenio. Very, very good pronunciation of my surname, which is quite unusual. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. This is my second IDEO meeting, and a lot has happened since that previous one, including things that have changed my life forever, professionally, and of course personally as well, with COVID and everything, right? Let me see if I can make this work. This goes straight to discussion. I guess I can I get these slides?
Try the other button. There's a forward and a backward.
The backward one?
Oops.
No.
Oh.
I think you probably need to change the slide set, right, or something? Is that my fault?
No. No, that's our fault. It's just a data issue.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
Give me it.
Hold on 1 minute. Sorry.
No problem. Yeah, don't blame Ben, because I sent him my slides yesterday night, quite late.
Sorry, this is definitely on me.
Well, maybe I can introduce myself in the meantime. Good use of your time. Yes, I'm Danny. I'm an academic GP. I trained as a GP back in Spain before I moved to the UK in 2009. I came here to do my PhD at ENDOMS, which is the Department of Orthopedics and Rheumatology, where I learned a lot about how orthopedic surgeons handle uncertainty and how they kind of change practice or not based on the existing evidence. As a GP, it was kind of striking for me to realize that we have such a divergence between what happens in kind of primary care practice, where everything has to be guideline based, and every single prescription is evaluated, compared to what happens in surgery, where for many reasons you just don't have that evidence many times. Well, after a few years, I'm currently working still at Oxford as a professor of pharmaco and device epidemiology, and I lead a team of currently 36 people who do this kind of real-world evidence research. And more recently, since May, I stopped my clinical practice, and I'm now working 20% at Erasmus Medical Center in the Netherlands, from where I am co-leading something very exciting I will tell you about in a second, called Darwin EU. Okay, so I'm going to cover this topic of progress in scientific use of real-world data. When I had my first set of slides, I timed myself, and it was taking around 90 minutes. So you can figure out that what I'm going to tell you is a super summary of what I wanted to tell you. But feel free to contact me, and I'll be delighted to talk to you offline. So these are after the triage process, the 5 final bullet points I want to cover. I'll talk a little bit about open science and how that is changing the way we do things in real-world evidence. I will then talk about where real-world evidence is positioning itself in the life course of a medicinal product, which can be a medicine, a vaccine, and hopefully at some point as well, medical implant or a medical device. I'll then talk about this idea of how standardizing data can help us standardize analytics and do things much more quickly than we are used to. I'll then cover a little bit of work that we did funded by NIHR, looking at whether we can replicate a surgical trial. We've only done one using real-world data. And then I'll finish with some couple of examples of regulatory stuff that we're doing. One that was published in the BMJ a couple of weeks ago, and this We Need You initiative. And I'm going to keep an eye on time. Okay, so yeah, this is talking about AI and the topics covered this morning. If you are worried about how trials could be p-hacking, come and have a look at what happens in observational data, yeah? So that's a total of over 200,000 papers published in PubMed using observational data. This is the reason I say AI is that we used AI to extract the data and analyze it. And can anybody tell me where you think the p-value 0.05 is? Well, it's basically there, yeah? And what you can see there is, of course, people are p-hacking big time, right? I'm publishing everything immediately underneath the threshold and very little in this kind of funnel in the middle where, you know, we should have probably most of the estimates, right, if we were publishing everything we do. So I think that shows enough about why we need to move into a different space. I think real-world data needs to adopt the best practices that some of the people here have pushed for in the RCT world, like registering protocols, doing only what you say you do in your protocol, publishing all your results or making them available. And I believe very, very strongly, and I think I have experienced that through COVID with, you will remember Sergey's fear as a very painful experience, that this is the only way we are going to gain the trust that we need for this data to make a difference. When I talk about real-world data, everybody tends to worry about confounding and other things. My worry is this, yeah, reproducibility, interpretability, and trustworthiness. And this is something we can fix. There is a fix for this, which is basically following those principles I mentioned. This is the same data plotted now from a paper published by some colleagues in The Lancet in 2018, I think it is, where they looked at comparing all the antihypertensive medicines to each other with loads of data from around the world, observational data from around the world, resulting in almost 8 million treatment effect estimates, as you can see, which, believe it or not, don't cluster just below the p-value 0.05, but take a very, as expected distribution with almost 90% of the estimates, including the one, meaning there's no difference between both treatments. So that's, I guess, what we saw before. That would be focusing only on antihypertensive therapies, so 20% only of the published estimates cover the one showing a null effect compared to what it should be, which is 88%. Okay, so when we talk about real-world evidence, I think, again, many people, and rightly so, worry about confounding and how that can affect your treatment effect estimates if you're doing a causal inference study. I am going to defend that that's something we can do sometimes, but I am also going to tell you real-world evidence is not only about causal inference. There are many things that we should be doing that are descriptive and that don't have anything to do with confounding. These are the three kind of big buckets of studies we do in observational research. The easiest probably, and the kind of Cinderella of the whole thing, is characterization, looking at a group of people and saying what happens to those people. This, that was never the focus of anything in the past, is now, well, became a big part of our work during COVID, because we had to see what happened to those people that some folks, like our Prime Minister was saying, just had the flu. So that was important, and still is important nowadays. Patient-level prediction is everything that has to do with identifying algorithms to target people at high risk of a given outcome, and then those two things, I would say, are better done with observational data than with trial data, and I'm happy to defend that. This last thing here, which is causal inference, most of the times we will say need to be done with RCTs, but can be done in some instances with observational data, especially for safety. That's where we see most of the real-world evidence causal inference stuff being done. Okay, so if you were to think of a product life course from development all the way to post-marketing evaluation, There's many ways where you can intervene or do something useful with real-world evidence. At the development stage, if you think you have an idea or a product that might fill a gap, you can look at the natural history of the condition you want to prevent or treat. You can look at the descriptive epidemiology of that disease. You can do cluster analysis to identify people with different characteristics or features, and you can characterize current care and say, what treatments are people receiving for this condition. When it comes to clinical testing, and here I mean when it comes to conducting randomized controlled trials, typically, you can use observational real-world data to look at trial feasibility. We can tell you, out of the whole of the NHS, who is going to make it into your trial if you impose a new restriction or a new eligibility criterion, right? Because because we do have that information for everyone in the data set. There are synthetic arms trials being conducted. I'm not going to get into that. Contextualizing safety. This is something that people who do pharmacovigilance find very important. There are pragmatic trials going on, and you will have seen some of those, especially in Scandinavia. And then extending follow-up. In my department, we have a big trials unit, 2 big trials units. One of them is C2, of course. And we do tend to ask for linkage to real world, to patient records, so that we can do follow-up of those patients in the longer term for safety and potentially sometimes also for other outcomes. Post-marketing safety and post-marketing evaluation is my passion, so that's where I do the most of. In that space, we tend to do a lot of work on utilization. So if a medicine or a product has a very clear target, in principle, you shouldn't see too much off-label use, but we always have that trend or time series analysis. This is something we do typically when the regulators intervene and say, you shouldn't be using this product for these people. You should then see a change in the use of the product. Post-authorization safety, you've heard a lot about the vaccine safety, right? So, and I will cover that example. And then comparative effectiveness is another space where I feel relatively comfortable with observational data, because by looking at people who use similar products, you are reducing confounding quite a lot, and that becomes manageable. I do not believe most of the time in any observational study looking at user versus non-user. That is total nonsense most of the time. Okay, examples. If you were to have a device that can be put into people to avoid a COVID-related venous thromboembolism, you could look at how often does that happen in the people with COVID. You could look at how long is that risk for. You could look at clusters of interest, potential causes for that, preventative treatments that people are already using. If you were to do a trial, you could look at real-world data to see, what is the impact of my eligibility criteria. What are the background rates, both of the venous thromboembolism, which is the outcome to prevent, and of potential pre-specified safety adverse events that you might know from similar devices. You could look at asking for permission to follow up to electronic medical records and, let's say, use that information in the longer term. And then post-marketing, assuming that device has been approved, you could then use this when you apply to regulators and say, when this is approved, I'm going to do a post-marketing study looking at who is actually using the device, is there any off-label use, what are the observed post-intervention versus expected safety event rates. You could propose, if you want, a cohort study looking at post-marketing safety, and you could do comparative effectiveness research if there is a product already in the market. So that's where we see real-world evidence. I don't think real-world evidence is about covering only one piece in the life course of a product. Now let me talk for a second about this idea of standardizing data and then standardizing analytics. This is, I was telling to Peter earlier, taking about 150% of my time nowadays. The idea here is that we do have data from many sources, data that in principle contains very similar information, patient records, patient registries, anything that's routinely collected in clinical practice. All those data contain similar information, but when I then say, oh, I'm going to do this analysis of, whatever question I want to answer, right? And I have some code that I've written. When I then try to plug that iron into the data, there is no way I can do that because data looks completely different. So the idea, the final product, I lost my slides suddenly. Okay. Yeah, that wasn't I wasn't my doing to keep you awake. So yeah, what happens in the end is that we end up with something like this, right? Everyone has to write code, and then we end up with something that's clearly not scalable, not transparent, not reproducible, super expensive, very slow, and I can tell you from experience, doesn't help you sleep at night. So the proposed solution that many people have been using and that we are pushing and using in Europe quite a lot nowadays is this idea of let's standardize the data first, let's make sure the data looks exactly the same in all those different places, and then that will allow us to standardize the analytics. So for things that we do repeatedly, like calculating an incidence rate, I don't need to have 100 ways to calculate incidence rates. I need to have software that's robust, well-tested, statistician-proof, and everything that you need. And then once we have that, we just plug it to all those places and get the answer back. This is just one common data model. There are others. This is the one that has become a de facto standard in Europe for many reasons. But the idea is basically that you transform your data, you keep your data as it is, but you create a new version of your data which looks like this, with the same tables, the same structure, the same format. And then that allows us to do this thing that we call distributed network analytics or federated analytics, where someone, let's say my team here at the Bodnar Research Center, writes code against some data that we also have previously mapped, and then we share that code with the partners who don't ever send me any of their patient level data. They just run their code, get the answers, and send me the results back. And that preserves all the kind of, GDPR and any related regulations. That helps us quite a bit with all these desirable attributes of real-world evidence and probably many other research, not only real-world evidence. This idea of, repeatability is when, you're gonna look at the same question, same person, same data, same analysis, you should get exactly the same result. Reproducibility is where you change the researcher and again expect to get the same result. Replicability is when you change the data, maybe use some similar data, and you should not get the same result, but you should hopefully get something similar. Generalizability is where you change the data a lot, and you also expect to get a similar answer. And then robustness is everything to do with changing the analysis a little bit to test your assumptions, right, and the impact of those. So using this idea of standardized analytics helps a lot. The idea of having the possibility to get people to rerun this same software all the time allows us to check reproducibility very easily, because so to do an incidence rate, you just need 50 or 100 lines of code altogether from source data to answer. It helps us a lot with replicability and generalizability as well, because it allows us to run the analysis in many different data sets. Okay, let me talk for a second about characterization. This is an example of something we've done with our first ever pipeline developed from our team, looking at analyzing, producing incidence rates, prevalence rates, and the likes, population level disease epidemiology measures from an OMOPT, from a common data model data set. This is a study published in the BMJ last year, all about preparedness, giving the regulators background rates of the adverse events of special interest for COVID vaccines before things started happening. And things started happening pretty quickly, because we published this in, I think, February, and in March we had the AstraZeneca signal. So we basically gave the regulators these beautiful figures with data from loads of countries, as you can see, and loads of different data sources, giving them age and sex specific incidence rates of all the pre-specified safety events for COVID vaccines in all those data sets. I think it's 15 data sets. And this is kind of the meta-analytic estimate, where they could then look at what happened post-vaccine and say, okay, in this group of people vaccinated, I'm observing an incidence rate of 300 and I'm expecting 100, well, that is worrying, right? If I'm seeing 100 and I expect 100, then that is less worrying. Something as simple as that is something we should be doing probably in surgical evaluation and medical device evaluation. Now, this idea of target trial emulation is something that was initiated by colleagues in the Coastal Lab in Harvard and by many others around the world. And we did this one study funded by NIHR HTA, looking at whether we could replicate a trial that had been conducted in my own department, looking at comparing partial versus total knee replacement. I think some of the people in the audience were involved in that as well. The idea was that we would try to replicate the trial. We had a stop-go milestone where we said, if we don't replicate it successfully, we'll stop there. But if we do, we will then analyze the same question in people who were not eligible for the trial. And that would be basically, as you can imagine, people with lots of comorbidity and the likes. Yeah, I'm only going to present the trial emulation. I'm not going to show the results for the people with comorbidity because we don't have time for that. We use data from the National Joint Registry linked to hospital episode statistics and the PROMS database. These are all NHS datasets that can be linked together. And we use propensity scores, which is this probability of receiving your target treatment based on your own characteristics. Yeah. So here the target treatment, the novel treatment would be partial knee replacement, and the usual treatment or the kind of current care or most common care would be total knee replacement. We used, once we had the propensity score, which is this probability of receiving the treatment based on your covariates, we then used matching, weighting, stratification, and adjustment, a number of different flavors of analysis. The primary outcome was Oxford knee score after surgery, and a secondary outcome included 5-year revision risk. So this would be people getting the implant replaced, revised, and so on. I'm cutting straight to chase, but at the top you see the result from TopCat for the main outcome, the primary outcome, which is Oxford knee Oxford knee score after surgery, and the confidence interval for that. And you can see here for the 3 main analyses: propensity score, stratification, propensity score, matching, and IP weighting, which is a flavor of propensity score. What happened when we analyzed the whole cohort, so that would be everyone in the NJR, and when we looked at the sensitivity cohort, this would be looking only at the surgeons who had equipoise and therefore would have been eligible, because in surgical trials we don't only have eligibility for the patients but also for the surgeons. When we looked at patients and surgeons that were eligible, we got much closer to the actual answer. In any case, as you can see, the result overlapped for all the estimates we obtained. And to the right, just not to be too simple, binarizing, you have I square, chi square, and tau square. And we pre-specified what would be a replication, a successful replication, as an I square below 20%, non-significant chi square, and I don't remember what we said about the tau square, to be honest. But these 3 clearly replicate the trial. When you then look at 5-year revision risk, the trial didn't see an increased risk of revision, which I think is one of the successes of this trial, because all previous observational data had suggested an increased risk of revision with partial knee replacement. Here what's really interesting is that if you look at the whole lot, we do get what all the previous observational analysis had shown. But if you focused only on surgeons who had done more than X number of partial knee replacements, then you got much closer to the result from the trial and successfully replicating it already and in all 3 types of analysis. We did still see, though, an increased risk of revision, with the exception of this analysis here in surgeons who were very experienced and using this very specific method called IP weighting. So it could be that the trial didn't see the increased risk because the power wasn't sufficient for that. It could be that this is a lucky shot, so that we can just say, well, you just replicated one trial, that's never going to happen again. Well, because I'm a bit, there's this thing going on, right? Like when you say I do observational research, everybody says like, but that never provides a reliable answer. There has been people around the world who, instead of repeating the mantra, invested some money in investigating whether that's true or not. And we now have the answer from this study called Duplicate. I really invite you to look at that. There's a webinar of, I think, 30 minutes by Shirley Wong looking at that. This is, of course, about medicines. Yeah, there's nothing there about surgical trials. but they emulated 30 RCTs, and although I don't have time to go into the detail, they replicated the trials that were replicatable, if that is a word in English. So basically, when a trial is very tricky to replicate in observational data, for instance, because the outcome doesn't exist in observational data or because the inclusion criteria are very difficult to identify, that made it more difficult to replicate the trial. The other issue that they observed is that the more pragmatic the trial is, the more likely it is that you will replicate it with real-world evidence. This is, of course, using top-notch methods like the ones I presented, not using hey, I think there's not going to be confounding here, I'm just going to go and do a regression analysis. Yeah? Okay. Yes, I'll just finish super quickly. I don't have time for this, but if you want to see some of the work we've been doing and publishing, and this is a study funded by the European Medicines Agency looking at the comparative safety of COVID vaccines, published a couple of weeks ago, using data from 6 countries, using this idea of federated analytics. The answer is that we did see what we expected, an increased risk of thrombocytopenia and a trend towards an increased risk of thrombocytopenia with thrombosis with adenovirus-based vaccines compared to mRNA vaccines. And I'll tell you just super quickly about this initiative that's basically taking all my time, called Darwin EU. This is the EMA's initiative to create something similar to Sentinel in the US, gathering data from all over Europe to basically answer regulatory questions. This is the directorship. This is my job at Erasmus, and this is the way it works. So basically we have the coordination center at the middle, data partners from many countries around Europe, all of them previously mapped to the OMOP Common Data Model, and then federated analytics. All the questions come from the EMA's committees to EMA, and they then ask us the questions, and we answer them if we can. We do a feasibility assessment first, and then if we can, we answer the question. And I will stop there. I'm really sorry that I overrun, but I've gone from 90 minutes to 25.
Thank you. And we have time for a few questions for Donnie, because he has a time constraint afterwards, so we happily take some questions now. I know I have a million in my head, but I'll email you about them.
Sure, yeah, you can email me.
Any questions from anyone in the audience?
Peter.
Well, I'm looking up.
Danny, I apologize, this isn't actually on the main thrust of your work, but you did mention that you felt that your work was all in the post-market area. We had a lot of discussion about the place of regulation in driving the production of good evidence for devices and operations yesterday. And my personal view is that the pre-post yes-no cutoff is potentially very harmful in terms of collecting good data. Do you agree, and do you think there's anything that can be done about it?
I think that is an analysis or a design that's very prone to confounding, right? So it's very difficult to think that you can compare post-surgical to, background rates of anything really. Is that what your question is about? No. Okay.
What I'm meaning is that in both the EU and the FDA, there is a dichotomy: either you're pre-market or you're post-market. As soon as you're post-market, a lot of the incentives to collect data and to do good science vanish. So we lose an awful lot of information. And when you're pre-market, particularly in the device space, there's a huge amount of doing things because you expect the regulators to ask them, which distorts the evidence considerably. Yeah. If you had a total product life cycle system where it was required to give the regulators information about the evidence as it evolves, it seems to me we would get rid of a lot of that.
Yeah, so the field of medicines regulation has changed quite a bit. I don't think it's so dichotomized nowadays. So we are doing a study for a pharma company that the EMA categorized as category 1, meaning that you can only get the approval if you do the post-marketing authorization, yeah? And that typically requires external collaborators, you know. So I think, and there's also these adaptive pathways for, you know, rare diseases and conditions that you don't have a treatment for, where you can get approval conditional on collecting more data. So I think that's been enabled for medicines, at least in Europe. I don't know that much about the FDA, maybe Art can speak about it. The field of devices is trickier because it's regulated at the national level and there's a lot of heterogeneity.
And just a quick question. The OMAP model is great, works for drugs. There's no device identifiers. It's not possible to really do anything with the EHRs. And what happens in operating room is never going to be captured well in any of these data models. I mean, can you reflect about this? Because this is a crucial issue for devices versus drugs.
Mm-hmm.
These models, for the next 10 years, I can't see how they can apply to what we do. And unfortunately, because of the investments people are making an impact, including, you know, Duke Margolis Center talking about Europe, global work, influences FDA to fund this idiotic thinking nest, which is bring the EHRs together, create some sort of a network, and we can study devices.
Mm.
Can you comment about that?
Yeah, so that's of course not only about the common data models, but the source data many times doesn't have that detail, right? If the source data had the detail, we would be changing the common data model to enable that. Like, you know, the OMOP common data model doesn't have genomics embedded, but we've created an extension. There's a lot of work now being commissioned on pregnancy safety, like, you know, pregnancy pharmacoepidemiology. And yeah, the OMOP CDM is not great at that. Off you go to create a new table. So those things work when there is a motivation, right? And I think there has to be good source data collecting that level of detail, and there have to be regulatory requirements. That's what's going to move the field forwards, and that's what I've seen with medicines, which, you know, when I started on this topic in 2011, I was looked at like, why are you throwing your career away just focusing on this thing that nobody's going to, you know? So I think with devices, I am still optimistic that this thing will happen. We were in a very sweet spot in Europe until COVID came, right? And then I feel like we need to regroup and start doing this stuff again.
One last one, please.
I was very interested in the analysis of the top cat data.
Yeah.
Epidemiological data. And I was trying to think, what do we need going forward? Because to get the answer most quickly, so do we need the pragmatic randomized trial that's done more quickly? Or do we need the big data sets to get the same answer? You're saying the answer was the same in that one situation. But if the answer, and I think TopCat showed they were equivalent or there wasn't much difference between partial and total, but if a trial showed a disbenefit, we'd want to know that as quickly as possible. Which would be the quicker way of getting it, or should, you know, what? It's nice to see that they match, but it doesn't tell us what to do next, I don't think.
Yeah, so I think what I would like to know is what to do before as well, right? So I think what we need to learn is which are the very scarce situations where observational data can give you reliable effectiveness and safety data without doing a trial, because that's where you're going to save time and effort and money and everything. And I don't think we know that yet, but we are learning from those initiatives like Duplicate or Replicate. We are learning, as I said, that trials that compare two products and where you want to do something pragmatic, so for an intervention that's already in the market, of course, it looks like TopCat, if you think in retrospect, was one of those examples, right? Uni knee replacement has been around for a while. There are a few surgeons that already do it. So you could, as we proved, expect that the real-world evidence will give you reliable answers. The other thing we need to work on with real-world evidence is we need to have really robust diagnostics to be able to tell you when we are worried about confounding, because this is so far very much witchcraft. You know, it's intuitive and people say, oh, I think there is confounding. I need something more quantitative than that. And I think we are getting there with that. So there's a lot of methodological research going on the use of negative control outcomes for calibration, on the use of a number of diagnostics to tease out where are you in trouble with confounding.
But we still need big trials at the moment.
We do, yeah, and we will always do, right? Because we, especially for new medicines or devices, they are not there in the data yet, so we're going to need them.
Thank you. you very much, Donnie, for that.
Thank you.
Really great, I really like the description of witchcraft. It makes sense, you know. It's kind of sort of. So I want to introduce Art Sedrakyan, who's the vice chair of Weill Cornell, who's the vice chair of IDEAL. That one, yes. And if we can, for Art and the following speaker, if we can have the questions after the presentations, it'll make it a little bit easier to keep track of things.
You can put honorary in the front of vice chair because Peter has been doing all the work. And I'd be really pleased to help advance IDEAL in a device space and try to bring the technology questions into the mix. And really in past 10 years have been critical in recognizing that surgery has become device-based and has been technology-based. So the regulation hit us hard. And the way manufacturers or the companies are the often major funders of technologies. And certainly that's influencing how surgery is progressing and evidence based behind surgery. So I just want to go back 5 years when we started this conversation in New York in a major symposium that we organized together and talked about real world evidence. This helped us accumulate more and more data and better understand how we can leverage those routinely available data sources that we call real world evidence these days. And this is essentially the definition of the real world evidence, the data that comes from multiple data sources, billing data sources, EHRs, registries, pragmatic trials, and also now we have sensors and wearables added to the mix. So I think this is pretty messy. So we have to understand and think about the limitations of these different data sources. Even though FDA announced this intention to use the real world evidence, they're very different. Some of them are collected for purposes of care delivery, like administrative data, EHRs, and registries are more focused, but traditional, they've been built to improve the quality of care. Again, it was not the purpose of registries to do research per se, and as soon as you equate registry with like a study, then you confuse it with the cohort study, which is built to answer specific questions. And registries are quality improvement mechanisms, so we have to remember that and follow the IMDRF recommendation, which try to get more harmonization internationally around the concept of registry. And finally, pragmatic trials in this context are critical because they are built to answer specific questions. So those, in fact, have a question in mind, and that might be, particularly leveraging real-world evidence, be really useful. So we added this in our position paper, this caveat that we can live with this definition of real-world evidence, but we have to make sure that this data is collected as part of routine care delivery. Because otherwise we confuse it with cohort design, which is again meant to answer a specific question, and that's not really real-world evidence. When you collect more data, you influence people's behavior. And that's different than already available data for other purposes that we call real-world evidence, and we can reuse it to answer questions that are relevant for surgery and devices. This is really important for us. And it was foundational for IDLD, you know about this, and intertwined with the regulation. But let's go one by one through stages and understand what was the purpose and how IDEAL approached to these issues and whether real-world evidence can help, right? So here's preclinical stage 0, bench testing, animal models, and what IDEAL is recommending often come up with better standards for testing, preclinical testing. We're not there yet, and metal is a very telling story how it failed. Those preclinical testing methodology did not help us avoid the failures of the materials. So I think more needs to be done in that context to develop better technologies. Now, can real-world evidence help? Well, none of these data is available in any of those real-world data sources. Certainly, it can't. But then there's really important issue that Moreska talked about, and the issue about understanding the need in a population, the burden of the condition, possible impact of innovation. So that can come from databases, that can come from real-world data sources, and we can define how much improvement we can. It's sort of what analysts do in Wall Street, right? They want to understand what's the impact, what's the market share. So this is type of analysis I think we can do to better understand the population level impact of innovation. And then certainly, are there any similar therapies out there we're trying to innovate? This is particularly important for stage 1. And we know, like, I just depicted the pig heart implanted in Maryland. There's not going to be a second implantation. The patient died. Thank you. So the stage 1, we have really detailed description, recommendation for a detailed description of the outcome of what is it that innovation, and again, this is not going to be captured in any of the real world data sources, EHRs to registry to claims, so that won't be available to us. And again, even in stage 1, the main value of real world evidence, again, is going to be in understanding the burden of the condition, the need for innovation, and potentially market sort of analysis. So as we progress to stage 2, when 2A, particularly when initial tinkering is happening with the technology and innovation is sort of occurring with the technique changes, we do recommend the flowchart and very innovative way of depicting changes and impact on outcomes. Now, I tried doing this the other day in OR, and I couldn't find any way to document this in an epic. You really need to take a lot of notes, and I can talk about that next, but certainly if you start including in any of the real-world data sources like a registry, you essentially create a prospective cohort study already. So it is not going to be available in those data sources that we consider real-world evidence. And here's the, again, technology I was talking about, image-guided surgery. The first case series are done at Cornell, and on the left-hand side, we came up with a 3D sort of a pre-op planning methodology. So you can see, like, in this particular situation, the intestine is punctured and guide wires are inserted to reach small bowel obstruction. So to perform this operation, a balloon will be inserted into intestines and try to relieve the adhesions and relieve the symptoms of small bowel obstruction. So during the operation, I counted over 30 devices that were tried. So different guide wires and off-label use of 1 billion different products. Who is going to depict all that? And even if you get all of that in the EHR and then you have a list, you don't know which one followed what, which one at the end was successful, you wouldn't know. But if you have a company comes back and says, oh, can you guys look at the data and see if our products were used during that operation, you will have that exposure and you will have the outcome, but you would have no idea what else has been used. And would be, again, more than 30 different products, and at the end, only one of them was successful, right? So stage 2B, this is the larger adoption of a technology, and we know we recommend large, uncontrolled cohort design. 100 plus is just a number, right? It can take really long time until technology reaches stage 3. So we do need to build consensus definitions and outcomes within this design. We do believe that at some point during 2B, there is a way to leverage real-world data, and our focus has been registries. Because I think when we reach maturity for a technology, and ECRF is more or less standard, I think there's a potential at this point to initiate a registry, either include the data within existing register or a new one. Certainly critical to make sure that this is very valid data. So some of the sampling and validation studies are critical, data audits are critical. And the example of this is TAVR registry, you could say like the TAVR registry was more of a post-market, but in reality, for the purpose that it was designed for, it was still in a 2B stage. Because the trial was done very quickly. For the national and international, from national international perspective, if you think about it, it's still like an evolution and learning happening of how to use this device. And there weren't like many procedures done at the time. So the registry in some ways served as a mechanism to learn about learning curves and understanding direct comparison that could be done like with a surgical valve replacement, which is still ongoing. So most importantly, when FDA came up with a transcarotid valve registry, they partnered with Medicare, the payer. So billing codes were immediately available as well. So we could do a cheaper long-term evaluation by having both registry and claims data together. So this is really helpful in terms of planning also future research, right? So the stage 3, certainly we prefer RCTs for comparative purposes. They're not always possible. We know that this is a very complicated issue. I admire that work what Danny talked about, trying to emulate a trial using observational methodology. It's difficult. So nesting the trials within these real-world data sources is a major recommendation that we have. We do believe that this might be the way we can leverage real-world data, particularly within the registry system. It's possible in future we can also do within EHRs, but right now it's not really realistic. But there are examples of nesting within real-world data sources. And it started about 10 years ago, right? The Swedish registry nested a trial within the SCAR registry and evaluated the outcomes of thrombectomy, and this led to the editorial in New England Journal of Medicine by Mike Lauer and Ralph D'Agostino. Mike Lauer is the person who funds research in the United States. He's the deputy director of NIH for extramural research. And I approached to him a year later and asked, what can we do for NIH to fund more of this? And he said, you got to do it cheap. $5 million or less, 1 R01 level funding, that's what we have. The time for doing $100 million trials or in $20 million trials is gone. We don't have the money. So I think this is critical. How do we do these trials cheaper? Leveraging real-world data sources is what NIH is interested in. And here's a more recent example. Again, coming from Sweden, the paclitaxel-coated stents. There's been a meta-analysis published about the harms related to paclitaxel-coated stents and higher mortality associated with these devices in using peripheral vascular surgery. And SweetVasc registry managed to randomize 2,300 patients and did not find higher risk of mortality associated with coated stents. And it pretty much, ended the debate. So it was really critical and very powerful when you can do these large pragmatic trials nested within registry. It really provides you the answer. And unfortunately, we don't have many examples of this right now. What we have is cohorts still nested within the registries, but not necessarily randomized clinical trials. There's a lot of cohorts now nested within the registries for regulatory purposes. So certainly most of the use of the real-world data is within stage 4, when we recommend long-term and rare event monitoring. So again, the registries are critical. Administrative data sources can have a role, and in the absence of registries, they can fill many gaps. We do have a lot of evidence accumulating about ability to use these data sources when there's a unique product with unique code, particularly available in the data. And that's the place maybe we can use the OMUP and others for standardizing international data sources. So again, we need to make sure that the registries we're using follow the guidelines of IMDRF for high quality and have all the maturity that we need. But more and more, I think what's important is to link these data sources and create coordinated registry networks. So by leveraging registry and billing data and EHR sometimes, we can create this more like a powerhouse. And ability with this, it really doing cheaper and high impact studies is growing with these type of data sources. So important again to recognize that when we have hundreds or thousands of devices on the market, there are no pragmatic ways to use any other data sources other than real world data. And this is another mechanism, the coordinated registry networks, that brings a variety of real world data sources together and maybe even clinical trials. This is what my team does. And we do routinely maintain, buy all these data and create linked data sources that can be used to look at the device-specific outcomes. Like in this study published last week at the BMJ, we looked at the vascular devices used for endovascular treatment of aortic aneurysms. More than 600 centers in a vascular quality initiative in the United States, about over 20,000 patients with various devices. And our outcomes are claims-based because we track outcomes within Medicare, reoperations, ruptures, mortality. But the initial exposure data on devices is in the registry. So by merging the two, we get exposure data about technology, about confounding factors, but the outcomes we can track in the long term within the billing data source. So, and here are some results from this investigation. The early outcomes of Endologics, the AFX, the blue, is the outlier device that has been concerned, FDA has been concerned about this product, and we were able to find that early signal in this data source. And in fact, what we also found in a sort of surveillance analysis, that if FDA, or if we were to have a funded surveillance activity in this coordinated registry network environment, we could have depicted and we could have found this effect at least 3 years earlier than what FDA was able to detect. So certainly the data sources are there, but there's no good funding to maintain them, to link them, continuously update and purchase new data. I think this is all expensive and requires a lot of skill, a lot of efforts, and funding is quite limited at this time. So it also helps to create international consortia if there are registries and similar data sources and replicate this linkage model. We replicated this linkage model recently in Australia at the University of New South Wales that maintains linkages of administrative data sources within the state of New South Wales, and a vascular registry agreed to conduct the linkage of their registry with those claims data sources. And now Annals of Surgery paper looks at the outcomes in a similar way we published at BMJ and just got accepted in European Journal of Vascular Surgery. But this international consortium can also help us look at the outcomes internationally and learn from each other. It's certainly a critical issue for real-world evidence, understand why there's a variation in outcome. It took us like 6 years to build trust with folks until they agreed to share the data and be able to look at the international outcomes and performance, because certainly this is political and there's surgical pride involved and many other issues. But if you know that in some countries the outcomes are a lot better, I think there's opportunities to learn and understand why does it happen in some places. Again, the summary, we do believe real-world data has value in all stages. Again, it's much more important starting from stage 2B, and particularly important for stage 4. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, thank you, Art, and we're going to save questions for Art till after. We now have Professor Xin Sun, the head of the Ideal China Center, and he's going to get patched in-ish. But actually, you know what we can do even in the meantime? Oh, nope, that's me. Goodness. It's never nice to see yourself from behind. I've got to say, I don't like it. And there we have Professor Xin Sun.
Hi.
Oh, stand up straight. There we go. Whenever you're ready, we are ready for you.
So now, okay, great. Right, so can you see the slides now?
Yes.
Yeah, all right, okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thanks for Peter for giving or offering the opportunity to present. So Peter actually gave me actually the very challenging topic, which is actually real data, advantages and problems. But when I talked with Peter about what I can talk, I'll actually will specifically focus on the use of real evidence for regulatory decisions in China as an example to show what are actually has been doing and what are the potential problems and the potential for advancing the ideal framework for the regulatory decisions. So that's actually what I would like to talk today. Before I talk about the use of real evidence for the regulatory decisions in China, what I want to show as an overview is the real evidence initiative in China. So, in China, the use of the real evidence or the educational activities for real evidence actually started in 2010, around that time, so when the concept of real evidence actually has been introduced in China, which actually have been a little bit behind what the world actually develops for the real evidence, including in the States or in Europe. But after that, when the concept of real evidence has been introduced in China at the time, so everybody actually have been very enthusiastic about the concept, and the data and the volume of data about the healthcare actually have been accumulated very quickly in China because of the large population. And then since 2010, the methodologies and the data infrastructure has been developed for decades, and that's actually have been what we actually have been seeing for the last decade, and including the development of the method guidance documents issued by the academic organizations, and as well as the sort of the development of the Congress or the educational activities regarding the real data and the studies. So that's actually what we have seen in the past decade, and until 2019, when the real evidence actually had been officially adopted by the regulatory body, which is actually by the National Medical Products Administration of China, and specifically now the regulatory body actually have adapted the real evidence for the new drug approval, including the devices as well. And then just 2 years later, when this concept has been disseminated across the governing bodies in China, now the Healthcare Security Council in China now also has accepted the real evidence for coverage decisions. So these are just really a short overview of what are the real evidence activities in China, but what I want to really talk about is actually specifically on the regulatory decisions, because this is actually the hot topic and also the focus of the real evidence development in China. So specifically in 2019, when the National Drug Administration actually has been paid a lot of attention for advancing the regulatory sciences, and the real evidence now has become the hot topic, one of the hot topics that actually advancing that regulatory sciences in China. And at the time, the regulatory real evidence has been proposed to incorporate into the development strategies and action plan of the regulatory body. At the same time, actually, that same year, the regulatory body actually issued the action plan for using the river evidence to for the new drug approval. And one of the significant advances at the same year was actually the initiation of the pilot application of real-world evidence and data in Bo-Lecheng, which is actually especially administrative region in China that actually used the real-world data for a new drug approval. Just 1 year later, there actually has been a lot of technical guidance documents issued by the National Drug Administration, which is actually the National Medical Products Administration as well. So across these 2 or 3 years, there has been a lot of efforts that have been put into the production of the real-world evidence as well as the application of real-world evidence for the regulatory approvals. Just following the initiatives by the regulatory body, which is actually EMPA, what we call it. And there has been quite a bit of the efforts that have been undertaken by the centers under the MEMPA, including the Center for Drug Evaluation, Center for Medical Devices Evaluation, as well as the Center for Drug Evaluation, which is actually the counterpart or the similar organizations with the FDA that are responsible for the drug approvals, medical device approvals, as well as the post-approval studies in China. So these are actually the really responsible organizations or the entities that are actually pushing forward the development of the real-world evidence for approval of the drugs as well as the medical devices and the post-approval studies. And at the time, they are also have been developing quite a bit of the work on the real-world evidence. So this is actually exactly what is happening in the past several years that actually in which the guidelines for using the real-world evidence to support the drug development review as well as for the medical devices and clinical evaluation has been issued in the past several years. Specifically, one of the guidance documents that has been issued was about using the real-world data for medical devices clinical evaluation. As you actually see here, there were actually 11 scenarios in China that we actually can use the real-world data for supporting the medical devices clinical evaluation, as well as the post-approval studies. For the first 5 or 6 scenarios, and from 1 to 6, these are the actually scenarios that will support the use of the real-world data for the medical devices registration in China, including the registration to supplement regular submissions, as well as the support the registration of the important and foreign listed medical devices for urgent clinical needs. But for the from the 7th to 11th scenario, these are actually just the scenarios that we actually can use the real evidence to support the post-approval studies, including the benefit sides as well as the safety sides. So these are actually what we actually have been pushing forward in China that actually use the real evidence for the regulatory decisions. So what I actually would focus on as a general topic, or the focused topic, is the real evidence study in Bo-Lecheng, which is representation of the use of real evidence to support the medical devices registration. So Bo-Lecheng is actually just a small region in Hainan province, which is actually the Iceland, just south of the China, just within the South China Sea. So you probably can see that from the region, there's only just part of the Iceland that actually have been allocated for using the medical devices as well as the drugs that have been approved overseas, for example, by the FDA or the EMA, and then but not otherwise approved in China. So such medical products, even though they had been not approved in China, but they can actually be effectively used as the routine clinical practice in such especially indicated region. And the people across all China actually can travel to this region for the use of such specially approved medical devices or the drugs. Under such a policy, so there actually have been a lot of the people traveling across the country to use such drugs. And by using such drugs, the real world data actually has been generated through the routine care. And the data, not just generated from this region or the healthcare institution that is in this region, but also the data from the home care institutions would also be collected, so that the data for an individual patient would be longitudinally collected, in which actually the baseline characteristics, as well as the treatments, as well as the outcomes will be collected and collated in a longitudinal way. So by using such a pattern, then all the real world data can be used to support the assess of the clinical effects, including the benefits and the safety in the Chinese population. And then by having such evidence, which what do we call it, the real world evidence in the Chinese population, and plus the critical clinical trials undertaken overseas, for example, that conducted in the States or Europe, and then for generating the phase 3 trials, for example, then we could have combined the real world evidence in the Chinese population as well as the phase 3 trials to make sure that it will be making a body of evidence or clinical evidence to support the clinical registration in China. And by using such mechanisms, we actually have been successful to make 2 cases of the one for drug and the one for devices that have been proved by the Chinese regulatory body. So one of the example for the medical devices was the Xin for the glaucoma. So this is actually a medical devices for glaucoma drainage. In Boarlington, we actually have at the time we actually have designed the cohort study in which we collect the data prospectively from the patients. That actually will document the healthcare data before they come to this region or this especially cared healthcare institution, but as well as the data that before they come and after they have returned to their home institutions or healthcare institutions. By having that, we will be able to develop a longitudinal follow-up and including outcomes. So for the cohort study, but at the time we did not develop the control. So there's no control arm, but we have set up the objective target outcomes to ensure that all the benefits will be achieved by assuming that the outcomes will be achieved through the objective outcome mechanism. But over the time, we found this may not be the ideal way. So now in our current practice, we would always include the control arm by using the data that actually generated in the routine clinical practice in the other regions. So in other words, we will actually include the synthetic control outcome or external control outcome for assessing the clinical effects. So that's actually what we're typically doing for the medical devices as well as the drugs in the Boao region, and then by combining the clinical trials evidence to generate the body of the clinical evidence about the clinical effects of the drugs as well as the medical devices. But over the time, we also have identified the methodological challenges, including the unestablished, or we found that the methodological framework have not been really completely established, among which the data quality standards need to be enhanced, including how we will be able to ensure that data will be complete, and how we would be also sure that the secondary data sources, for example, the HIS information, the hospital information informatics data will be also useful for supporting such claims. Another challenge we are currently facing is about what will be the best design to support the claim of the clinical effects of the medical devices as well as of the drugs, and what will be the best choices of the control that we will be able to use to support the comparative effectiveness of the medical devices as well as the drugs. Otherwise, we also have found that the selection bias and confounding issues have been the persistent problems in this area, and the methodological efforts actually have been warranted in the future to address this kind of issue. Aside from that, we also found that the consistency or inconsistency of the results between the real evidence in the Chinese population and trials. What will be the best solution to address this issue, and how we interpret about the inconsistency of the results between the real evidence in the Chinese population and the trials conducted overseas. So this is actually we are continue to face. In addition, we also have identified that even though we have used the sort of the real evidence to support the registration of medical devices, but there actually have been sort of the strong needs for the post-approval studies. What are the best solutions? So there's actually no confirmative or the definite solutions to address these kind of questions. These are all the methodological questions or challenges we will have to address. But over the time, when we actually continue to have a discussion with Peter and other colleagues, we were thinking whether it would be possible to use the ideal framework to address these kind of problems. Well, the ideal actually has been in some way to be useful to support the novel medical devices approval, which actually probably have been used by major regulatory bodies, for example, the FDA. But this is not the ultimate goal that we're actually being using for the Boao real evidence in China. So now what we're actually thinking about is actually based on the trial evidence that have been generated overseas, how we would be able to make sure that the ideal framework may be more useful for the real evidence generation in China. One of the potential stage that we can use is actually specifically stage B. In the area that I just mentioned, we can use such the concept from the stage 2B to support the generation of the clinical evidence from the Chinese population. And then by combining such evidence with the critical trial evidence, and then that may be helpful for speeding the approval in China. But this is not the ultimate goal. We are also thinking by using the stage 4 for long-term monitoring to conduct the post-approval studies and the monitoring to make sure that the safety will be consistent or actually have been really good in the Chinese population in the long-term observations. So that's actually what we are actually experiencing, and that's also what we actually have identified over the past several years in terms of the use of the real-world evidence to support the medical devices registration and the post-approval studies. I think that's what I would like to talk. Thank you.
And I can also happily relate. Oh, Jane, yes. So the microphone will make its way to you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I was interested to hear your comments about how to explore what's really going on in the phase 1 study, because you said you can't document 20 different catheters and devices being used, which makes complete sense.
Absolutely, that's not possible. But what we've been doing in Bristol is studying phase 1 studies across the country using qualitative methods. So non-participant observation and in-depth interviews with the surgeon before the operation, what they think they're going to do, and then in-depth interviews after the operation to find out what they did and why it changed, and observing it and videoing the surgery as well. And that data is incredibly rich. And there's been things that have happened that we would never have got in any other way hadn't we been at the scene of the crime, so to speak. And I would suggest that's what's needed at that stage, and we can't capture it in a quantitative way, but we do need to use qualitative methods and report them in detail.
So Jane, just to understand the focus of these papers,
real
try
world.
to leverage real-world data,
Yeah.
right? And we're saying we can't. I
Yeah,
think your
that's
method is not real-world, but it's exactly what's needed, right? So I think what we're trying to achieve is to bring a little more harmonization to the thinking, because it's really messed. People like threw in everything into that real-world evidence definition. And we're trying to make sense of it and still see if we can position properly, given the ideal is the right way to think about how do we sort of adopt the evidence. And the best way we can still find pieces that fit here and there. That's the purpose of this paper. And we're still in evolution. We might publish this, and a year later, you might show us 10 registry-based trials where you learned what can or cannot be answered in using real-world data, right? Let's think about it. If you nest a trial within registry, it's such a wonderful evidence for us to understand in future. Can you emulate that without sort of, because you have both data at that point, right? And you accumulate evidence to understand when trials are possible to do without doing them.
But I think what needs to become real world is that video and those interview data. So if the definition of real world data is
No consent, no ethical approval, you're just collecting the data. But maybe that's what needs to be shared. The information, the rich information that's collected using different methods is what's needed to be shared. And surgeons, I certainly know, if you show them a video of them, someone cutting a nerve by mistake, they take that in a lot more than looking at a load of p-values or I-squared values, which they definitely don't understand. They definitely get it if they see a video.
That's in fact very important for us to understand what cannot be done also. Because you ask them, what do you guys do when you cut the nerve? Are you even recording in the EHR? They're going to say, no, we're not putting that in. And you know you can't answer that question. Let's say my friend does a HIFU for prostate cancer. I mean, as soon as he had one bad outcome, he reported to FDA, and I thought it's confidential, because you go to database and you report it. Then 2 days later, someone called him and said, oh, the Dr. X had a complication from HIFU. Can you tell us more about it? He called the office. And now everybody knows that he had a complication from HIFU. He's charging $10,000 out of pocket for that. What do you think is going to happen next? And think he's going to report any of that or report it in the EHR? No way.
Yeah.
No one is going to put that in anyway.
Yeah, well, that certainly takes us back to the consent issue for the surgeon to. Yeah, I just want to say, Jane, I totally agree with you, and we've a very nice example of how video can be very valuable in stage 2A. And some colleagues of Marescas have been working on a minimally invasive esophagectomy technique using that. I don't know if Xin Sun's still here. Xin, can you hear us? Yes. So, first of all, many congratulations on your work with the Chinese authorities and the Hainan project. I just wanted to check because it seemed to me, I understood that you are recommending using ILEAL 2B studies for confirmation of the effect in the Chinese population of outside products. And of course, I would strongly agree with that because we published this paper very recently about the challenge of what to do with new devices and which ones need a randomized trial. And what you're doing was very much in line with our recommendation that if there is no novelties, no new question, then a randomized trial may not be needed, but in its substitute, an ideal 2B is the minimum ethical standard. So congratulations.
So if he's doing real world evidence, then he's going to do registry? Is that what he's going to do?
I think that was on the list too.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions? If not, what we'll do is go off to have our coffee and tea break, because everyone will need a little caffeine and solution. And then we have a very important session again afterwards, just to talk a bit about the future of IDEAL and where we're going and what comes next. But in the meantime, I want to thank the speakers for wonderful presentations.
Thank you, Sim.
Thank you. And so we'll meet back here at, what is it now? In 15 minutes. And what I'd ask you if the people would please come sit toward the front.